One of the Theosophical Society's more prominent aims was the creation of a synthesis between Western thought and Oriental philosophy. This idea had its roots in the Theosophical comprehension of India as a crucial source of esoteric lore, probably the oldest still to exist. The Society's leaders' decision to move to India in 1879, as well as their later efforts to sustain and support India's rising national movement, were the natural outcome of this idea alongside the belief in the seemingly identical kernel of wisdom which existed, as they claimed, in both Western and Oriental philosophies. Madame Blavatsky, who was the first to cultivate this perception, was evidently inspired by the work and ideas of Friedrich Max Müller, who was born in 1823 and died in 1900, who in his time was considered authoritative in regard to the study of Indian history and civilization. She had read Müller's numerous books and essays and was heavily influenced by him when creating her own fantastic doctrine. This lecture will draw some lines between Müller's Indian vision, which has stretched William Jones's Aryan myth to further dimensions, and Blavatsky's own Aryan philosophy based primarily on Müller's Orientalist study. I will emphasize as well the sometimes awkward attitude shown by Müller towards Theosophy in general and Blavatsky in particular. There is no doubt that Müller despised Blavatsky. Perhaps this has to do with her being a brave, original, outstanding woman in a time in which serious men expected women to behave quite differently than her. I will first shortly sketch Müller's biography and research, and later will emphasize his influence on Blavatsky. Friedrich Max Müller was born in 1823 in Dessau, in the independent duchy of Anhalt-Dessau, in eastern Germany. His father, the poet Wilhelm Müller, wrote the poem cycles Die schöne Müllerin and Winterreise, which were put to music by Schubert. His godfather was the famous composer Karl Maria von Weber, and it was he who gave him his middle name, Max, which he later adopted as his last name, the name of the hero of his opera, The Freischütz. Müller began to attend the University of Leipzig in 1841, majoring in Oriental languages, including Sanskrit. He passed the test for the doctorate of philosophy before his 20th birthday. Soon afterwards, he published his first book, a German translation of the ancient Indian collection of fables, the Hitopadesha. Having obtained his doctorate, Müller spent a year in Berlin, attending the lectures of Franz Bock and Schelling, and later continued his study of Sanskrit in Paris, Europe's main center of Orientalist research, where he studied with Jean Burnouf, the holder of the Sanskrit chair at the Collège de France. It was Burnouf who suggested that Müller would translate the Rig Veda, a huge project which brought him fame a few years later. In June 1846, Müller went to London, where his translation project was sponsored by the East India Company. In 1850, he began to teach modern literature and languages at Oxford University, which remained his home for the rest of his life, during which he became known as the world's leading authority on India. At the same time, Oxford University became the leading center for the study of religions and Sanskrit philology. Müller became a member of All Souls College in 1858 and remained there till the end of his teaching career. In 1868, Oxford University announced a new chair of comparative philology created especially for him. Thereafter, he could devote most of his time to researching his favorite subjects. From that time till his death, he gave a series of lectures at Oxford, Cambridge, Birmingham, Edinburgh, and Glasgow, but devoted most of his time to writing. Full of energy, he began to publish the 50-volume series, The Sacred Books of the East, which began to appear in Oxford in 1879. The series included translations of the Quran, the Brahmin and Buddhist scriptures from India, the texts of the Zoroastrian religion from Persia, the Zendavesta, and the writings of Kung Fu Tse and Lao Tse from China. Some of these texts he translated, and others were done under his editorial supervision. The immense project set out to present the Western reader for the first time with complete translation of a vast literature, which, in Müller's opinion, had hitherto been translated either partially or amateurishly. The production of this series kept him busy until the end of his life. It is considered by many to be, at least in part, an authoritative translation, and it was certainly the crowning achievement of his life's work. Over the years, he acquired a position of influence, not only in the academic sphere, but also in the political one, especially with reference to India, a distinguished position achieved by few academics. His researches into India's ancient culture served as the basis for his Aryan vision and his dream of unifying the two principal branches of the ancient Aryan nation, the Indian and the European. His influential position facilitated the promotion of this vision beyond the limits of academic life. His reputation spread also to India, where he became known as the great friend of the local culture. When his translation of the Rig Veda arrived in India, local pundits dubbed him Moksha Mulara, the one who brings freedom. His reputation and standing as a major key figure in England's social scene as well added an important aspect to the assessment of his influence. This, of course, rested primarily on his standing as a scholar and his cause of academic publications. Müller was an unusually prolific writer. From his translation of the Hitopadesha till his death, hardly a year went by without at least one book of his appearing, if only a collection of his papers or lectures. In addition, he published numerous articles in newspapers and periodicals, and throughout his career, he promoted his main idea, the common source of all religions above all Christianity and the religion of the Vedas. The methodology of philological research in which he first won fame became the tool with which he sought to substantiate this idea. It led him to found a new academic field, that of comparative religion. In this way, Müller, the son of the poet from Dessau, came to link the Orientalist thought in Germany, France, and Imperial England, and became one of the most renowned scholars in the world. I will demonstrate his research methods with two of his major writings in which he promoted a change in India's image. Until Müller's time, India was commonly despised and comprehended as a primitive land by all means. Müller was directly responsible for the change of that negative image, since it was he who composed its new perception, a glorious place which had a wonderful past and was awaiting a spiritual renaissance. As some of you may well know, Madame Blavatsky's vision of India was quite the same. His groundbreaking article, Comparative Mythology, which marked the birth of the field of comparative religion, appeared in April 1856. It contained most of the working assumptions that would serve him in the future, and its stylish blend of scientific materials with a romantic approach would characterize his writing for the rest of his life. It was this blend which gave his work its ideological content, with implications far beyond the conclusions of the scientific research. In comparative mythology, Müller described the mythological era in which all the Aryan people had similar mythologies. He maintained that in prehistory there had been an ancient Aryan nation whose culture gave birth to the original myths. These migrated far from their geographical source as the primary nation broke up into secondary ones, and the primary language sprouted various secondary Aryan languages. He asserted that comparative philology made it possible to identify and isolate the elements of the original Aryan language from the myths preserved in the languages which sprang from it. The mother language was the source of Sanskrit, Greek, Latin, and German, in the same way as French, Spanish, and Italian sprang from Latin. Müller, like William Jones before him, believed that the origins of the Aryan race lay in Central Asia. Before the ancient Aryan nation became divided, there was a time when every word had a central signification, but the original significance of these words was forgotten until they became myths. To explain this historical process, Müller coined a new term, the disease of language, which Julie mentioned before, which he used to narrate the way the original ancient Aryan ideas degenerated until they became myths. He claimed that in order for an idea to become a myth, it should be forgotten in the original language in which it was first phrased. Hence, a comparative examination of various Aryan languages, and especially the Sanskrit, might help us expose the original ideas that gave birth to the later Aryan myths. The apex of comparative mythology was the formulation of the solar myth, an idea that would become most closely associated with Müller. The solar myth rested on the assumption that the sources of all religions, especially the Aryan ones, lay in the interpretation given by ancient people to natural phenomena. in particular to the sun and the dawn. Thus words which originally signified sun, dawn, and the like underwent a process of identification with divine or mythological entities and as a result lost their original signification. Some 36 years passed between this essay and the 4 Gifford lectures Müller gave in Glasgow in 1892, the latter which were published the following year in a book entitled Theosophy of Psychological Religion, represented his spiritual convictions towards the end of his life. They may therefore be seen as the summary of the field of research to which he had devoted his life. They defined all religions as attempts to conceive infinity. He argued that all natural religions, those that derive from a belief in the forces of nature, shared 2 indispensable characteristics: belief in the eternal deity and in the immortal soul. The religion he called psychological comprised both characteristics in such a way that they seemed to correspond. The deity is perceived as linked to the soul, and the soul is perceived as divine. The belief in the infinite soul and deity inevitably leads to the recognition of their unity, since there cannot be 2 simultaneous infinities. The term psychological religion served Müller as a substitute for the terms mystical religion and theosophical religion, which he felt had been misused to the point of distortion. He stated that theosophical religion engaged in wild speculations about the deity's unknown nature, while the term mystical gives a vague and arcane impression. Müller never visited India. Nevertheless, it was the center of his intellectual interest throughout his life. He said that his interest in India began when he was a schoolboy. One of his school books bore a picture of men and women bathing in the Ganges. They struck him as beautiful. The mosques and temples on the riverbanks looked more regal and impressive than the churches and palaces in Dessau. The picture fired his imagination as a child in the class and caused his mind to wander in the classroom. When the teacher noticed, so Müller told just shortly before his death, he made him copy many pages from that book which were filled with the motifs of Benares, the Ganges, and India in general. In this original way were engraved in his mind the landscapes of the country which would preoccupy it throughout his adult life, though he never once set foot in it. This story helps to illustrate Müller's conception of India. His imagination retained the picture of a land of magical landscapes and a wondrous atmosphere, even when he had grown and became a well-known scholar. India's exotic-looking inhabitants, which despite their dark complexion seemed to his child's eyes to differ from the black races, which he actually defined as niggers in his own words, became in his adult writings the kinsmen of his own race, the European Aryans. This childish image of India, essentially a part of an Oriental fantasy, was developed in his adult life into his Aryan vision, which didn't have much connection with reality. Müller's books on Indian subjects were widely distributed and helped to implant this fantastic image in the general public. We may conclude that Müller's vision entailed an imaginary India, which existed only in dreams about the glorious past, and historical echoes arising from her ancient literature. There was no real connection between that imaginary country, which I suggest to refer to as Celestial India, and the actual geopolitical entity. It was this imaginary concept which animated Müller when he urged modern men to change his attitude towards the wretched India, which was suddenly shown in glorious raiment as the homeland of the Aryan race. Similarly, the proposed alternative for the future of humanity, the synthesis between East and West, with India as the purest marvel and the land in which true knowledge is preserved in its purest form, arose in his mind in an abstract fashion, almost without any connection to the physical reality of India, which in any event he only knew from secondary sources, certainly not from first-hand experience. The subject of India remained the area in which Müller's influence was more significant than any other in which he engaged. His responsibility for the new Indian image overshadowed all his academic achievements, his splendid translations, and highly developed theses in comparative religion and philology. Most of his great achievements in these fields, except possibly the sacred books of the East, fell into oblivion soon after his death. In contrast, his efforts to change the Western perception of India made a major contribution towards the view of India as a matchless cultural and spiritual source, a wondrous land holding secrets waiting to be discovered. Madame Blavatsky's first major composition, Isis Unveiled, from 1877, is a difficult book to read, confusingly written at times, and loosely narrated, which makes one wonder about the actual number of people who have read it from its first page to the last. Nonetheless, it is certainly impressive regarding Blavatsky's exceptional imagination and her acquaintance with her contemporary scientific publications, and particularly those of Friedrich Max Müller's. Its importance, academically speaking, lies with Blavatsky's change of orientation regarding the origins of the occult. Until then, occultists considered ancient Egypt as a sort of esoteric wisdom. The advancement of philology and religion studies during the 19th century helped to widely spread the Aryan myth and the belief that India treasured the oldest spiritual wisdom. Thus, the academic research headed by Müller unintentionally influenced the esoteric arena. Blavatsky, who admired Müller, adopted his views with a little twist and replaced Egypt as India as the source of occultism. This sharp curve was about to influence the Western image of India and make it an ongoing focal point for spiritualists worldwide. Isis Unveiled is full of quotes and references from leading contemporary Orientalists, scientists, and scholars of religion, among them Jean-François Champollion, Heinrich Schliemann, Whitney Darwin, Jones, and of course Max Müller, whom Blavatsky especially favored. His name appears in that book as frequently as Moses or Hermes Trismegistus. Isis Unveiled didn't go unchallenged by the press. The New York World, for example, argued that Blavatsky showed ignorance about Indian history. Her furious response betrays her extremely high self-esteem, and I quote, "A pretty wide reading of Europeans' authority has given me a very poor opinion on them, since no two agree. Sir William Jones himself, whose shoestrings few Orientalists are worthy to unite, made very grave mistakes, which are now being corrected by Max Müller." Blavatsky and her co-founder of the Theosophical Society, Henry Steele Olcott's early work laid the foundations of the great transformation effected by their successor, Annie Besant, who perhaps more than any other Westerner contributed to India's national liberation. Thus, the Theosophical Society became the foremost instrument implementing the ideas promoted by Müller from 1856 when he published his article, Comparative Mythology, to his dying day. Müller kept a close eye on the ongoing story of the Theosophical Society. An illuminating example for his attitude is evidenced in his references to the end of the short relationships between Blavatsky, Olcott, and Dhyananda Saraswati, the founder of the Arya Samaj, whom the two founders of the Theosophical Society sought to study from on their arrival to India in 1879. It took Dhyananda Saraswati, who was very friendly towards Blavatsky and Olcott, a few months to change his attitudes and denounce all connections with Theosophy. In faraway England, the affair intrigued Müller, who stated that Dhyananda Saraswati, and I quote, was still more unfortunate in falling for a time an easy prey to Madame Blavatsky's spiritual fascinations. For some time he understood her as little as she understood him. But when at last they began to understand each other, there followed a breach that could never be healed. Müller explained this breach thus: poor Dhyananda Saraswati had no idea of what Madame Blavatsky was thinking of, but though bewildered for a time by the unaccustomed adulation poured on him and the extravagant veneration paid to him by Europeans, he soon recovered and declined to have anything to do with the Polish prophetess and her vagaries. That's how he calls her. But Müller was as condescending about Tenata Saraswati as about Blavatsky. His ignorance of English deprived him of much that would have been helpful to him, he wrote, and would have kept him from some of his wild ideas about the Vedas. There is a visible connection between the altered perception of the history of ideas that the academic world experienced in the 19th century and Blavatsky's historical discoveries. As we have seen, Müller, the leading figure in the academic study of India, himself developed a refurbished history, romantic and charged with moral cultural messages about the supposed links that had existed in the past between India and the rest of the world. Müller, who following Schopenhauer, asserted that Christianity was a synthesis created in Egypt between the Semitic and the Aryan thought, unwittingly influenced Blavatsky's elaboration of her own version of history. Following in his footsteps, she argued that the religion taught by Jesus was not Christianity but Buddhism. Moreover, it was a secret Gnostic doctrine he had learned in Egypt. She solved the problem of the assumed connection between the ancient Indians and Egyptians by declaring that the latter were actually descendants of the Aryan Indians who reached Egypt as a colonial Aryan outpost. Not coincidentally, this assertion echoed William Jones's hypothesis. In this matter, Blavatsky was clearly inspired by the spirit of the Orientalists. Thus, for example, in her attack on Darwin's theory of evolution, she quoted Müller's statement in Comparative Mythology that man's condition had not necessarily been more backward in the past. Blavatsky's second great book, The Secret Doctrine, included a translation with partial commentary of an ancient poem named The Book of Zia, which had come into Blavatsky's possession by marvelous means. Her copy of it, she claimed, was the only one extant in the West. It was written in an ancient language called Sansar, known to practitioners of the occult in ancient times, and The Secret Doctrine offered its first translation into a Western language. According to Blavatsky, the translated stanzas of the poem contained an abstract algebraic formula whose decipherment helped to understand the cosmic evolution from the low to the high. Blavatsky explained that the reason she had a unique copy of this ancient and unknown text was that it had been given to her in 1880 by the leader of the Arya Samaj, Dayananda Saraswati. And I quote, "If Mr. Moksha Müller," she writes, "were a Brahmin and came with me, I might take him to a Gupta cave near Okimat in the Himalayas, where he would soon find out that what crossed the Kalapani from India to Europe were only the bits of projected copies of some passages from our sacred books." The conclusion to be drawn to this account was that if the Book of Zion was unknown in the West, this didn't make it any less authentic. However, this fantastic tale in which Blavatsky made free with the reputations of both Dayananda Saraswati and Müller tells us something about her. By 1888, when The Secret Doctrine appeared but long before, it was already evident that Müller regarded Blavatsky as a crank, harmless at best, or at worst, from her point of view, as actually harmful. Apparently, Blavatsky had grown a sufficiently thick skin to resist such criticism. Despite Müller's known opinion of her, she continued to quote him and make use of his research. The Secret Doctrine, like Isis unveiled before it, is full of references to Max Müller, giving the impression that she greatly admired him. Müller's harsh criticism on Theosophy did not cease, even after Blavatsky's death in 1891. Following the World's Parliament of Religions at Chicago in 1893, he wrote to one of the Parliament's main speakers, the Sinhalese Buddhist reformer Angarika Dharmapala from Ceylon, who became by far the most popular Buddhist representative at the conference. Dharmapala was a devoted theosophist and a close ally of Henry Steele Olcott in Ceylon. In the summer of 1896, he again visited the United States, stopping on the way to meet Müller in Oxford. Müller had earlier in July 1895 written to Dharmapala to persuade him to take part in an international congress of religions in England. He urged him to keep up his efforts to revitalize his original pure Buddhist religion, noting that his Theosophical friends were charlatans. And I quote, "Nothing has injured Buddhism so much in the eyes of scholars and philosophers in Europe as what goes by the name of esoteric Buddhism. Madame Blavatsky may have been a dear friend to you, but truth is a dearer friend." Possibly Müller's strictures affected the Mapala, whose relations with the Theosophical Society cooled in the late 1890s, and in the end he broke off with Olcott. Müller was involved in the moves that led up to the World's Parliament of Religions, as well as in the debates held in the course of it. His interest in the conference stemmed from his desire to advance this discipline he had founded, comparative religion, which was still in its infancy. Very likely, he disliked the fact that the Theosophical Society had been invited to take part in that conference. In the 2 months leading up to the event, he attacked the society with actual ferocity. The attack signaled a sharp change in his attitude towards the society and its leaders, as his previous expressions had been much more tolerant. Indeed, he had corresponded with Olcott for several years and regarded him as a contributor to the study of India's religions. Their communication began with the founding of the library at Adyar in 1886. The library increased rapidly and accumulated a considerable number of valuable manuscripts. Müller viewed this work favorably and agreed to advise Olcott. His supportive attitude is shown in a letter he wrote Olcott on July 24, 1888, praising Theosophical efforts in translating Sanskrit texts and urging him to devote his best efforts to translating the Upanishads. Olcott naturally valued the connection with Müller, whose authoritative standing was precisely what he was looking for. In their early association, Müller's attitude to Olcott was friendly and good-humored, as may be deduced from the description of their single meeting at Müller's home in Oxford in 1888. As a convert to Buddhism, Olcott was uncomfortable about the placing of 3 Buddha images on the hearthstone in Müller's library. He advised his host to display them in a more respectful way to avoid hurting the feelings of devout Buddhists. Müller replied that the images had been placed on the hearth because the ancient Greeks regarded it as the most sacred place in the house. Müller's tolerance turned to rigid dislike, which became most intense in 1893. The opening salvo of his campaign against the Theosophical Society was the publication of Theosophy of Psychological Religion, with an introduction in which he claimed that, I quote, "It should be known once for all that one may call himself a Theosophist without being suspected of believing in spirit trappings, table turnings, or any other occult sciences and black arts." His decision to describe the collection of his lectures as a campaign against theosophical activities was clearly due to the Society's relative success at this time and the anger it aroused in him. On March 22, 1893, he wrote Olcott, "That is what you and your friends have been looking for. That is what you will find in my last volume of gifted lectures, entitled Theosophy of Psychological Religion. You should now try to persuade your friends in India to make a new start, to return to their ancient philosophy in all its purity. If I've spoken and written against you, I should have done just the same against myself and my best friends when I said that they were seeking for the truth but were going on a wrong road to find it. You can do much good in India if you will treat the Hindus not as children, but as men." Olcott evidently was unimpressed by these suggestions. The June issue of the Theosophist, the Theosophical Monthly, carried a harsh criticism of Theosophy or psychological religion. Müller's attack came to a head in May 1893 in an article entitled Esoteric Buddhism, the title borrowed, consciously or not, from Alfred Percy Sinnett's book, harshly denouncing the late Blavatsky and the Theosophical Society. And I quote, "It is sometimes represented as the height of professorial conceit that scholars like myself, who have never been in India, should venture to doubt statements made by persons who have spent many years in that country. This has always been a very favorite argument. If Sanskrit scholars differ from writers who have been 20 years in India, they are told that they have no right to speak, that there are manuscripts in India which no one has ever seen, and that there are native scholars in possession of mysteries of which we poor professors have no conception. When asked for the production of those manuscripts, or for introduction to these learned Mahatmas, for India is not so difficult to reach in these days as it was in the days of Marco Polo, they are never forthcoming. The fact is that there is no longer any secret about Sanskrit literature, and I believe that we in England know as much about it as most native scholars. Müller argued that the confusion in these matters had to be laid at the door of the late Madame Blavatsky, the founder of esoteric Buddhism, in his own words. I have never met her, he wrote, though she often promised, or rather threatened, she would meet me face to face at Oxford. At first, she treated me almost like a Mahatma, but when there was no response, I became, like all Sanskrit scholars, a very untrustworthy authority. I've watched her career for many years, from her earliest appearance in America to her death in London last year. Like many people in our time, she was, I believe, in search of a religion which she could honestly embrace. She was a clever, wild, and excitable girl. That's how she refers to her. Like Schopenhauer, she seems to have discovered, through the dark mists of imperfect translations, some of the brilliant rays of truth which issue from the Upanishads and the ancient Vedanta philosophy of India. Unfortunately, she took it into her head that it was incumbent on every founder of a religion to perform miracles. We see that Madame Blavatsky might have achieved some success if she had been satisfied to follow in the footsteps of Rider Haggard. But her ambition was to found a religion, not to make money by writing new Arabian Nights. The conclusion of esoteric Buddhism was that Blavatsky was ignorant and egocentric in her pretension to found a religion of her own, while Müller himself, her polar opposite, so to speak, aimed to provide scientific knowledge to the whole human race and to all who were interested in religion as such. On June the 10th, 1893, soon after the publication of Esoteric Buddhism, Müller wrote Olcott. I can quite understand your feelings for Madame Blavatsky, he wrote, particularly after her death, but I felt it my duty to protest against what seemed to me a lowering of a beautiful religion. Her name and prestige were doing real mischief among people who were honestly striving for higher religious views. Madame Blavatsky seems to me to have had that temperament, but she was either deceived by others or carried away by her own imaginations. There is nothing esoteric in Buddhism. Buddha protests against the very idea of keeping anything secret. You can help to forward or retard the good work that has to be done in India. If I can be of any use, I am always willing to help. The July issue of the Theosophist reported Müller's article ironically. We cannot at any rate complain of want of attention just now. We are receiving it on every hand. The August issue carried an article by Olcott who wrote the following: a truth for Professor Max Müller to ponder before again prodding Madame Blavatsky through the sword of her grave, so to say. The September 1893 issue carried an extensive review of Müller's article by the Hindu Purendu Narayan Sinha, expressing great disappointment with the professor's ideas. Another indication of Müller's attitude at this time was brought up later by George Mead in the March 1904 issue of the Theosophical Review. Mead described his correspondence with Müller some 10 years earlier, soon after the publication of Theosophy or Psychological Religion. He wrote that Müller had asked him why he was wasting his time on Theosophy when the entire sphere of Oriental research was open to him. Above all, he was puzzled to understand why I treated seriously that charlatan, Madame Blavatsky, who had done so much harm to Oriental studies by her parodies of Buddhism and Vedanta, which he had mixed up with Western ideas. Müller summed up his opinion of Blavatsky and Theosophy a little before his death. Madame Blavatsky might certainly have done a good work if she had joined some really learned pundits, nor would it have been too much for a person endowed with such extraordinary, if not miraculous, powers as she was said to have possessed, to have mastered the grammar of Sanskrit. But what has been the result of all her labors? The true teaching has been obscured rather than illuminated by being mixed up with poor and contemptible conjuring tricks. There is no mystery about that philosophy. There is nothing esoteric in their teaching. It is difficult, therefore, not to get angry if one sees the elevated views of these ancient philosophers being dragged down to the level of cloudy hallucinations and rendered absurd by being mixed up with vulgar trickeries. The leaders of the Theosophical Society were not particularly concerned about Müller's harsh criticism. Alcott expressed regret that Müller had never been to India, where he might have understood, and I quote, that man's consciousness is able to grasp the ultimate truths by functioning on a plane higher than that on which dictionary, grammar, and encyclopedia are milestones by which a man's progress towards the attainment of knowledge is marked. Annie Besant, both Blavatsky and Alcott's heiress, responded to Müller's esoteric Buddhism by saying that he was merely a petty, narrow-minded scholar whose criticism was irrelevant to the students of esoteria. It is interesting to follow Besant in India. In the coming years, gradually adopting a preaching method that seemed to be taken directly from Müller's thinking, so that she appeared to be unconsciously recycling his established ideas. It is ironic that Besant, who regarded esoteric studies to be the heart of Theosophy and objected to the narrow-minded academic approach to Oriental philosophy, would become the leading practitioner of Müller's approach in later years. This was a short attempt to draw the fascinating relations which existed between Europe's top expert on India and the leaders of the Theosophical Society. All in all, it seems that while Müller's reputation has reached a point of almost total oblivion, his sometime friends and later adversaries have managed to keep their own reputation in a much more solid fashion, as is clearly evidenced here today in this workshop. Thank you very much.
So I guess the answer to anyone who wants to be remembered for years is to found a new religion. Don't be a scholar. We have some time for some questions.
Well, it's not exactly a question, but surprisingly, Müller was ignoring actually the two groups, the Orientalists and the Theosophists, were maybe the most important two groups that was helping the Indians to look into, if I would use the Gandhi term, to search into their own religion. And so maybe it just can be viewed as this kind of competition between Müller and Blavatsky, as between academic and the scholar, between scholars and academic researchers, and between religious missionaries. Like I put probably can hear the same argument between people who practice Kabbalah and people who do research on Kabbalah. You would get the same. You will get the same kind of conflict of people doing yoga and people researching Patanjali Sutra. It's kind of...
Well, you could see it actually as kind of a competition, but I wouldn't think that Max Müller himself would put it in this way, since he didn't think too highly of the Theosophist. In order to have someone to compete against yourself, you need to treat that person or that movement in a more of an equivalent fashion. He actually had quite a good relationship with Alcott, which he treated nicely, they tried to show. And I think that Müller himself was kind of an arrogant person, basically. So he was a true scholar. He hardly left Oxford for 50 years, from 1852 to 1900 to his death. Although he traveled in England, went once in a while to Germany to visit his family. But the whole concept of India and Indian culture was somewhat of a belonged to a certain mythical phase, so to speak, in his eyes. So the actual contribution of the Theosophical Society to the rise of the national movement in India, the founding of the Indian National Congress in 1885, etc., I don't think that this is something that I think he quite ignored it.
Not
All
only,
in all.
not only the political aspect, but also but I think it's the Theosophical Society helped a lot of prominent Indian intellectuals to find this self-assurance in their own religion.
Right.
It's arguing that actually he did the same in this way.
Yeah, but what made me really angry is the fact, okay, as we all probably know, the Theosophists was the first Westerners to actually travel to India and tell the local Indians that their religion, their history, and their tradition is no lower than those of the West. So in that sense, you're absolutely right. But I would say that looking from Max Müller's eyes, okay, as much as I can do that, it would be quite, I don't know, I wouldn't like to use a too harsh of a term, but I think he really disliked the idea that people who did not master Sanskrit, although Blavatsky claimed that she read Sanskrit, but that basically she probably didn't. I think that he didn't like the idea that people who cannot read the original text in the original language would preach it to the Hindus. He found the idea ridiculous and think that basically this is what bothered him the most.